समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
We are now getting into day 4 and going into day 5 and so on of the twin operation that Israelis and the Americans have launched as allies. For the Israelis, the roaring lion, and for the Americans, epic fury. It's the first time that they've launched an operation together from the very beginning. When the last one was undertaken, the 12-day war, Americans just joined in on the last day. Last day in the sense that they came and they bombed Fordo, the underground nuclear facility there, using big heavy bombers. And then Trump called an end to the war and also said that he was ordering, in fact, he did so on social media with the Truth Social post, ordered Netanyahu to call his planes back and end the war. That was a 12-day war. Americans had come in later. That's what Fareed Zakaria had then described as Donald Trump getting the FOMO, fear of missing out and getting in. This time, no FOMO. He did not take such a chance. He started in the very beginning with Netanyahu. Also, now we have on the authority of Marco Rubio that they knew that Israel was going to launch these attacks anyway on Iran, and that's why they joined in, because they knew that the Iranians will retaliate on their basis or targets close to them or targets that are valuable to them or countries that are their allies in the Arab world. So they decided to join in the very beginning. Now, as for the excuse or casus belli or casus belli as it's called, the cause for war, why do you launch war on somebody? Both Israelis and the Americans say that the Iranians were close to getting nuclear weapons. In any case, they were stockpiling ballistic missiles at a very high rate, which would have made it impossible for them to be contained subsequently, and that's why they had to be nipped right now. That said, the only statement we have is something that surfaced now. In fact, it surfaced today from Steve Witkoff, who's Donald Trump's envoy to every trouble spot in the world that matters to him, that is Russia, Ukraine, but also to the entire Middle East. Steve Witkoff, in an interview to Fox News, he said that the Iranians, the two guys who came from the Iranian side, they started out the negotiations by claiming that they were already holding 460 kilos of uranium enriched to 60%. And what is enriched to 60% just takes a week to be enriched to weapons grade. And he says that those negotiators said that we have 460 kilos of 60% enriched uranium, which can yield 11 nuclear bombs, 11 atom bombs. He said they started negotiating like that. And if they did that, and he said they had a lot of uranium, which is up to 20%, even if it's 20% enriched, they can enrich it to weapons grade in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, not more than that. So Iranians were on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. Now, this is a little bit contradictory of the claims that Trump made earlier when he had said that his strikes over Fordo and 2 other sites had completely obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. That is the expression he used then, and he's been using repeatedly since then. Obviously, that has not turned out to be right, or if it was indeed right, then this is not a justified excuse for launching a war. Nevertheless, the war is something that has now happened. Now, what happens? Trump has now said that he wants a regime change. Regime change through bombing is a problematic thing because no aerial campaign, no bombing campaign since the First World War. And I will give you some details from a study done by a Chicago University political science professor, Robert Pape, who's written a book about this. I will give you details of the book also as we go along. More than 40 bombing campaigns since the First World War he has studied. They've failed to bring about a regime change. So regime change is not going to happen because of that. It does seem, therefore, I'm summing up a few points to begin with, that if the Israelis and the Americans thought that once the top leadership of the regime is taken out, including Khamenei, there will be a popular revolt on the streets, that is miscalculation. No Arab Spring equivalent is taking place in Iran because the regime that's surviving is still strong enough. Also, Iranian nationalism is very strong. Second, for regime change in such a situation, you need the presence of friendly forces, quote unquote friendly forces. Those are not available. We see the son of Shah of Iran talking from Europe and other places. He doesn't carry that much weight right now. He also doesn't have people on the ground. And then Iran itself is not a stranger to regime changes, but those have come from within lately. 1979, the revolution, return of Khomeini, the fall of Shah of Iran, Raza Pahlavi, all that was indigenous. That happened from within. In fact, it's an irony that among the people most opposed to the Shah and who acted most proactively to get him out of power, leading the revolution, but the leftists of Iran, they were the first to be exterminated as Khomeini came in and proclaimed the Islamic revolution. That was an indigenous regime change, 1979. Before that, in 1953, the Americans and the British, in fact, I should say the British and the Americans, because the British led it then, they led the idea, they brought about a regime change. That's when the government of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was an elected prime minister, although there were questions about how that election took place, it's not for us right now to go into details of that, but he was a bit of a socialist or a soft socialist and nationalist. So he started out by nationalizing the oil companies, notably the British-owned oil companies. And that is something that was unacceptable to both Britain and America. And America then started an operation to get him out. It was called Operation Ajax, AJAX. John Foster Dulles himself led it. He was then Secretary of State. He served as Secretary of State for a long time. And the CIA then was headed by Allen Dulles. Many revelations about this were published much later by the New York Times, in fact, in 2000. Finally, the CIA itself declassified the Ajax files in 2013. Mossadegh's rise had in fact caused a very strong anti-Shah movement. So Shah had escaped to Baghdad, then to Rome. Finally, he came back because he became the American-British candidate or dictator to rule Iran, and that continued from then for 26 years. Mossadegh himself was put in house arrest, where he stayed for a long time. He died in 1967. In fact, it was in 1980, after Khomeini's revolution, that the Iranian government or the regime issued a postage stamp honoring or commemorating Mossadegh, because he was seen as an Iranian nationalist. Now, Khomeini's revolution was not peaceful. It was very anti-American in its character. We know the siege and ransacking of the American embassy and the hostage-taking. Then, because Saddam Hussein got scared that Khomeini will be able to export his Shia revolution into Iraq. Remember, Iraq is a Shia majority country. The Baath Party, Saddam Hussein's Baath Party that ruled Iraq then, was mostly a Sunni party. Its leadership was Sunni. Saddam was afraid that Khomeini will bring this Shia revolution into Iraq and he will lose his power, and effectively Iraq will come under Iranian influence given the majority will there. So he launched preemptively a war on Iran, thinking that Iran is weak right now. However, Iran was not weak. Iran took the blow, recovered quickly, launched counters by 1982 within 2 years, had pushed Iraq back from all the territories they had captured and had launched its own offensives inside Iraq and started taking territories there. Then there were counteroffensives. From the Iraqis. By 1988, both countries decided they were not getting anywhere with that war. 8 years they endured that war, nearly 1 million people killed on both sides. I'm just telling you this very brief history to make us understand how much of attrition are the Iranians capable of taking. That is the history that both Israel and the Americans, and now some of the Europeans who are supporting them, they have to keep in mind. Iran is able to withstand a lot of attrition and a lot of loss of life. That's the society, and that's the country with a population of 9.2 crores, and it's almost a homogeneous population. It's more than 95% Shia Muslim. There are not that many minorities, also because not many minorities are left, because the Ayatollahs would not let them survive in Iran. They've either fled or they've been pushed out like the Kurds. That's why this is a very homogeneous population. It's also guarded by mountains on 2.5 sides and has the seas on the other. It's going to be nearly impossible to carry out a land operation there. A country of 1.648 billion square kilometer. That's not going to be easy for any invading army to capture. And the population is twice the size of Iraq. It's in fact much more than the size of Iraq, population of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. That is what brings us back to Robert Pape and what he's been writing. He wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs last year. Before that, in 1996, he had written a book, Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War, where he said that aerial bombing, rather than bring about regime change, actually backfires because it usually rouses the population. And just an air campaign, he says, whatever superiority you might have, his study of 40 such campaigns since the First World War show that an air campaign has never toppled a government. And he gives you examples: 1991, Desert Storm. Before that, all the bombings in Berlin and places in Second World War, bombings in Japan, they did not have people rise up in revolt against their regimes. Even more contemporarily, I told you 1991, Operation Desert Storm, Saddam Hussein survived. When the Americans came back in 2003, then they had to start with ground forces. 1991, they did use ground forces, but they did not go the full distance, the whole distance. 1986, Americans tried to kill Colonel Gaddafi, but failed. Hit the tent in which he was supposed to be living. He wasn't there. He had gotten away from there, but a young girl who Gaddafi said was his adopted daughter, she was killed. In quote-unquote retaliation, Gaddafi's people carried out the bombing of the Pan American flight, Pan American 103 in 1988. That's the Lockerbie bombing, which resulted in the death of all 243 passengers and 16 crew members. That is something we've spoken about in detail in an earlier episode, of which I will share a link with you. And Saddam Hussein himself, 1991 and 98, tried to assassinate or remove him, did not happen. Then Saddam Hussein was captured in December 2003 and then executed after a trial of which we've seen pictures in 2006. Again, if you think only the Americans or the Western world has failed with this, look at the mighty Russians. Boris Yeltsin, he had Zokhar Dudayev, the rebel leader of the Chechens who wanted freedom for the Chechen Republic, Muslim population. He engaged him on a phone call. And while Dudayev was on a phone call with Yeltsin, Yeltsin's people had a radiation-seeking missile home onto Dudayev and kill him. That was a dramatic assassination. That did not lead to peace in Chechen area. That in fact led to even more trouble. His successor was even more extreme. Finally, the Russians, and then this is when Putin was rising to power, Russians had to carry out a 3-year brutal ground operation to take control of Chechnya. Finally, Putin made Chechen leaders his allies, and he's also used them to great effect in Ukraine as well. Robert Pape's view is that you can't just bring about regime change through an aerial campaign. If aerial campaign is a hammer, you need the anvil. So hammer has to come down on something, and that anvil is then your troops on the ground. The two have to work together. Just the air campaign cannot do it. Can the Americans and the Israelis afford to even think in terms of a ground campaign in Iran? I told you the degree of difficulty. I told you the size of the population. I told you the size of the country. I told you that on 3 sides it's protected by mountains, and on the other side it has a sea, and therefore the beaches where you get exposed. Also, it has a history of fighting, and it has a history of taking a lot of casualties and surviving. Everybody knows, Americans know, Israelis, in any case, are not into ground operations of this magnitude. They are much too small for this. But Americans also know that if they do this, they are most certainly going to be bogged down for a very long time and will not win, because their history tells you that even where they've used ground assaults to bring about regime change, it hasn't worked. Afghanistan, the Taliban came right back. In Iraq, finally, the Shia power came in. Okay, elections took place, but what happened? In elections, the will of the majority asserted itself, and a Shia-dominated government came back in, because Shias came to power, the old Sunni elites that made Saddam Hussein's Baath party and his government and his generals, they broke away, took away their tanks and all other stuff, artillery, and they joined ISIS. That's how they took over Mosul and all those areas. That led to a lot of violence, and it's because of that American presence in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Then maybe Al-Qaeda declined, but Al-Qaeda seamlessly morphed into ISIS, which became a much bigger problem. At the same time, Taliban only kept on getting stronger. Even with ground assaults, this regime change business has not worked out. The Soviets carried out a ground invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. They killed Hafizullah Amin, then the ruler of Afghanistan. Nothing happened. After that, they installed a government. That government was defeated by the Mujahideen, who also then assassinated ceremonially and in public and brutally Najibullah, who the Soviet power had installed there. So these regime change operations have not worked for any side so far, unless the people of the country want it. And even there, I will not talk about this in detail because we mentioned this many times. We have the history of Arab Spring. That is when the people wanted change. Libya saw Arab Spring, Syria saw it, Egypt saw it, Yemen saw it. What happened in all those countries? In all those countries, while the popular will wanted change that came about did not bring stability. In some cases, the old dictators came back. Say, for example, in Egypt, some countries became failed states and remained broken. Say, Libya and Yemen. One country remained broken for a long time, sent billions of refugees to Europe, America, Canada, to the Western world, and has now been taken over by a former Al-Qaeda IS leader, in fact, a notorious terrorist carrying a huge American reward on him, Ahmad al-Shara, who for long had a bounty unless he became president and the Americans were kind to him. Once again, this tells you that this business of regime change, forced regime change. First of all, you cannot bring it about just with air power. Second, even if you use air power and ground power, that is hammer and anvil, it doesn't work if the people are not willing. And even when the people are willing in many of these countries, most of these countries, it doesn't work out, because even if people are willing, there have to be institutions of a democratic system. That's how even a regime change through street protests in Bangladesh can lead to a stable conclusion. A regime change through street protests, say in Nepal, can lead to a stable conclusion. Nepal is having elections right now, but not in any of these countries which has never seen any real democracy and institutional structures. In Iran, if anything, whatever differences you might have, the Ayatollahs have created some kind of an institutional structure, and that will add to the degree of difficulty that both Donald Trump and Netanyahu have in this case.